Well, lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me. And I think, as you said in your introduction, who would have expected me to be here doing this in this government? But actually, it's more unexpected than that, because I don't think many of you know this, but 20 years ago, I used to tiptoe through here as a very deferential international civil servant on the way to Emeka Nyuka's office, or to that of my boss, who is looking down on me from the wall up there. But you know, I moved into politics, and now doing this job, and it's a great privilege to be here doing it. But I'd like to start by way of introduction just to thank Rupert for all the work he's done in launching these awards, working with UKTI in my department, and we're very appreciative of the work you've done, cultivating this concept and developing this awards. I'd like to thank Lord Wolfe as chairman of the judging panel, and Lord Hurd, who was, I think, chairing the advisory group that stands behind it, and we're very grateful to all of you. I think I'm expected to say something wise, or at least thoughtful, about responsible capitalism. I realise I'm in slightly dangerous waters. I gave a speech on responsible capitalism at my party conference, and I was written up the following day as an anti-business business secretary, and in one newspaper as a communist. So what I say will be very carefully couched tonight in order that I don't fall into the same mistake. But, you know, there are people who do, you know, probably would regard responsible capitalism as a bit of an oxymoron, you know, like bureaucratic efficiency. You know, the two things don't go together, because capitalism is supposed to be about, you know, unfettered, unqualified, aggressive pursuit of profit. But I have to say, I don't see it in quite such a stark way. I mean, the two things are not incompatible at all. I mean, there have been episodes, and we know there have been episodes, notably in the build-up to the banking crisis, where, you know, very irresponsible, foolish, short-sighted behaviour caused immense damage. And, you know, that the capitalist system at its worst does have that kind of outcome and does behave in that kind of way. But that's not intrinsic to it. And there are many, many examples of how the capitalist system works very well and very responsibly. And I think there are certain sort of defining characteristics in companies that I think we would be looking for if we wanted to encourage the concept of responsible capitalism. One is long-termism, you know, thinking beyond short-term profit, investing in the long term. Another is, I think, thinking about employees, engaging with employees, training over a long-term period. Another is, you know, ethical behavior that involves, you know, self-denial of profit because of some ethical purpose. And I think we can all think of examples in each of these different categories. I mean, I think the John Lewis Partnership is a very good example of kind of very long-term thinking. We've got, you know, big manufacturing companies which have invested in the UK and which make a major contribution. I think Japanese car companies are actually a very good example of companies that think a generation ahead. I used to work for a big oil company, Shell. You know, it's controversial in some respects, but the great thing about it was that they used to think, you know, minimum 20 years ahead. You know, my job as their chief economist was helping with scenario planning, which was, you know, what the world would be like in 20, 25 years' time. So it wasn't, you know, short-term pursuit of profit. It had this bigger long-term picture. So I think that's one of the defining characteristics of responsible capitalism. Another is thinking about the workforce. And this happens in sort of different ways. As it happens, I was born and brought up in York. Some of you will know is the centre of the chocolate, and it used to be anyway. And my father and mother, when they first started their working lives, were shop floor workers at Rantries and Terrace. And there was a sort of tradition of self-consciously responsible capitalism, and they invested heavily in their workforce. They built them homes and theatres and gave them shares in the company. I mean, it was a bit paternalistic, a bit cloying, and probably wouldn't have fitted today, but it worked at that period, and it established a real kind of long-standing loyalty. And I think I've seen one of the things that's really impressed me actually in my current job, and I spend a lot of time going around factories, is the way that a lot of British companies, or British-based companies, not always British origin companies, British-based companies, responded to the recession. We expected It's not a party political point. I think it's happened under the last government. But we expected, I think, that unemployment would go up to over 3 million. It didn't. It stayed down quite a long way below that. And one of the reasons was that a lot of private sector companies took a long-term view about harbouring their labour force. I mean, because many examples, the car industry, I think, was a good example, but there are many others, lower-key enterprises, which sat down with their trade unions, worked out work-sharing arrangements. A lot of workers, they're often not given credit for it, accepted pay cuts, accepted part-time working arrangements in order to keep their jobs. And throughout the private sector, there was an enormous amount of that kind of solidarity. You know, I hope we'll get that in the public sector as the squeeze starts to bite. But certainly amongst many private sector employers, there was that kind of far-sighted thinking about the relationship with their workforce. And one particular example that struck me, I was doing a guided visit of General Motors, Ellesmere Port, you know, brilliant world-class production line car company. And one of the things they pointed out to me is that throughout the recession that followed the credit crunch, they didn't stop their apprenticeship program at any point. It was kept going. They kept going with the training. And we have, you know, companies in this country that have a brilliant record in apprenticeships. You know, Rolls-Royce are probably the sort of gold-plated example, but there are many others. Unfortunately, there are not too many. You know, far too few companies invest in their labour force. But we should celebrate the successes, and we should celebrate the good examples, and there are many of them in the UK. And then I think, thirdly and finally, there's ethical behaviour. I mean, some companies, you know, brand themselves on the basis of doing good and abstaining from doing things that are socially damaging. And it's often a hard way to make money, but you know, people do make money that way, and there is a growing number of investors who respect that, and ethical investment funds. There are a growing number of employees who want to work for companies that are ethical and responsible, and there are a growing number of customers who want that from the companies they buy from. So it can often be good business as well as good for the soul. So I think my basic conclusion is where I started, that you know, responsibility and capitalism, you know, can and often do go together. You know, we need a good capitalist system. You know, we need wealth creation. We need the private sector to succeed. That's how actually as a country we're going to get out of this mess. It's got to come from the private sector. But it's a private sector that I hope is taking a long-term view, is investing its employees, is behaving ethically. And I think amongst the gathering here, and certainly amongst the prize winners, we have exemplars of exactly that kind of approach. So thank you very much for your attention.